for me to be able to introduce Professor Prabhat Patnaik, who is a very eminent economist and belonging to the economic fraternity myself. I have known him by name almost all my professional life as a student as well. And I've been associated and have met him at various stages of my career. Professor Prabhat Patnaik studied at St. Stephen's College in Delhi. It is one of the prestigious colleges. I must say that I didn't know that before. So he's a Studenian. Then he did his MA at the Delhi School of Economics, which of course I knew. And that is again the place that any economist aspires to go to for his postgraduate degree. The Delhi School of Economics even today is very well known for its teaching theory and now a lot of econometrics too. Maybe Professor Prabhat Patnaik didn't get so much of a dose of it at that stage in the development of Delhi School of Economics. But they had a way of teaching them neoclassical economics, but with a little bit of a critical view, which again maybe is not quite so today. So in that process, he was introduced to Keletsky, Keynes, and other thinkers as well, which again you can see very clearly in his writing. But of course, it had much to do with his later career. The other thing is that period when Professor Patnaik was at the Delhi School of Economics, it had really eminent economists. It had Anand, our Nobel Prize winner from India, Professor Shri T, and Professor K.M. Raj. Professor K.M. Raj, I must say, I have an association with him. I actually did my MPhil under his guidance. In 1966, Professor Patnaik got a Rhodes Scholarship and went to study at Oxford. Finally, he had a couple of shifts there, and then later on he completed his PhD from Cambridge. So it's quite a very the lineup of his academic career is quite something. I mean, that really speaks to his contribution later on. Oxford and Cambridge, I suppose, contributed to his formation in two ways. That was a time when there was a rich tradition of development economics at Oxford, and that international perspective is something that really adds to your understanding. Besides that, his stay coincided with worldwide upsurge of student radicalism, particularly in May 1968, which threw him into the company of some exceptionally bright fellow students, mostly from other disciplines, and forced him to develop some acquaintances with these disciplines. And in that, maybe that whole youth movement, he got acquainted with the large body of classical and contemporary Marxist literature, and gently with the history of socialism. When his Rhodes Fellowship expired in 1969, he joined a junior faculty position at Cambridge, and he was a fellow at St. Clair's College. Then he returned to India in 1974 and started to teach at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning in Jawaharlal Nehru University, which is where we know him to have been. And he retired from there recently in 2006. After that, he was the vice chairman of the State Planning Board, Kerala. But I had the good fortune to have sat in on some of his classes, even though I never went to JNU, to which also I had applied. But at that point in time, I joined at my MPhil at Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum, and he happened to come and teach us a set of classes. He took a set of classes on industry, which were really very enlightening. I'm sure I never understood too much at that time, but I definitely understood that he was an eminent economist, if nothing else. Without any more ado, I will invite Professor Prabhat Patnaik to deliver the 22nd Rajan Memorial Lecture on the theme of the perverse transformation.
Dr. Unni, Dr. Mukul Kumar, friends. It's a pleasure and a privilege for me that I have been asked to deliver the T.S. Rajan Memorial Lecture this year at this renowned institution about which I had heard so much, but which I am visiting for the first time. It's also a pleasure and privilege to be introduced by Dr. Unni. When I first met her, she was roughly the age of most of the students here, and that was at CBS Trivandrum. The T.S. Rajan Memorial Lecture in the past has been delivered, to my knowledge, by social activists. I'm not a social activist, I cannot claim to be one, but I hope what I have to say will have some relevance for social activists. The topic I have chosen is called the Perverse Transformation, and this topic is really inspired by the title of a book by Karl Polanyi, who was a professor at Harvard, who wrote a book called The Great Transformation. What Karl Polanyi was referring to was a massive shift of workforce that took place in the what we know today as the advanced capitalist world, from rural to urban areas, which basically means from areas of scattered settlement to areas of concentrated settlement, from agriculture to secondary and tertiary activities, industry in particular, subsequently in the service sector, and from petty production, small-scale, individually owned production units, to capitalist production. This interrelated set of changes is what Karl Polanyi referred to as the Great Transformation. It was a massive transformation, as we all know. Now, this transformation is something which occurred in a peculiar way. For instance, the shift from petty production, which means individually owned production units, whether in agriculture or in craft production, to capitalist production, where you have concentrated workforce producing on a much larger scale. This change was referred to, or if you like, the destruction of petty production was referred to by Karl Marx as a process of primitive accumulation of capital. Basically, what Marx had in mind is that you have a historical process in which the small producers are either dispossessed, they lose their land, they lose their assets, or alternatively, even if they are not fully dispossessed, even if they continue to produce, the flow incomes they get keep getting reduced over time, where it becomes increasingly difficult for them to sustain themselves over time. Now, this process of dispossession or distress of petty producers was referred to, because of the transformation of the economy in a direction which we know today as capitalism, was referred to by Marx as a process of primitive accumulation of capital. In other words, the process of transformation that I'm talking about, that Polanyi was talking about, was one which involved, on the one hand, a process of primitive accumulation of capital, and on the other hand, these dispossessed small producers, these laborers who used to work for the scattered, dispossessed small producers were then absorbed into capitalist manufacturing, into capitalist industry, into capitalist service sector. So you have a process of expropriation or dispossession accompanied by a process of reabsorption of those who are dispossessed in capitalist, in the workforce for the capitalist sector. Now, this two-phase process was, of course, very vibrant and occurred in an extremely vibrant manner in the advanced countries, or the countries that we know today to be advanced countries. Now, in the process of this transformation, of course, there was a substantial increase in the incomes of those who were dispossessed prior to their dispossession. There may be a period in which the dispossessed in fact lost their livelihoods, became destitute, became poor, but over a period of time, not necessarily they physically, but over a period of time, the absorption of the workforce into capitalism occurred at rates of wages which were higher than the incomes of those who had been dispossessed earlier. How was this possible? Polanyi, of course, puts the responsibility for this increase in wages, for the fact that this transformation meant on average an increase in the incomes of the producers. Earlier there were small producers or laborers employed by small producers. Later on there were workers employed by the capitalists. But in the process of transition from one stage to another, there was an increase in their average income. The fact that there was this increase in their average incomes is something which is typically attributed to the fact that there was, towards the end of the 19th century, a substantial unionization of the workers, that they got themselves organized, they struck for higher wages, and of course they obtained higher wages because productivity was rising anyway, so they managed to bid away a part of the productivity gains in the form of higher wages. But if you look at it carefully, trade union action in raising higher wages would not have been successful if you had had substantial unemployment in the economy. In other words, the capacity of the trade unions to bid away a part of the labor productivity increases in the form of higher wages is itself something which is a function of the unemployment rate in the economy and the fact that the trade unions in the latter half of the 19th century were able to obtain wage increases for the workers in today's advanced countries is something which is attributable to the fact that there was a tightness that developed in the labor market. So we have, again, to go back to this great transformation, we have a situation where there is dispossession of the earlier producers. For instance, in Britain, there was an enclosure movement in which the common land was enclosed by the landlords, and as a result, it became very difficult for the small producers who now no longer had access to common land to continue with their economic activities. Many of them left the countryside. Many of them, in fact, became destitute and migrated to urban areas or areas outside their habitat. Many of them were very poor. They were covered by poor laws and so on. But at a later stage, you had this enormous absorption of labor, and the absorption of labor created a tightness in the labor market. The absorption of labor was in activities where labor productivity was high, and as a result, the tightness in the labor market, or relative tightness, together with the fact of higher labor productivity, meant that you had substantial increases in the real wage rate. Now, this is the great transformation that Polanyi was referring to. Many believe that we in India or in other developing countries, I would even include China in this, are actually witnessing a repeat of this great transformation. That we are also witnessing a situation where you have a dispossession of the petty and small producers, dispossession not only in stock terms, in the sense that they are being expropriated from their existing property, many of them are being, but also in flow terms, where we have a reduction in their incomes, greater distress and so on, and that this again is going to be accompanied, if not immediately, then over a period of time, in their greater absorption into the workforce of capitalism, where of course they are going to witness much higher levels of real wages than they had been experiencing earlier. No less a person than my own teacher, Professor Amartya Sen, whom Dr. Unni referred to, when confronted with the fact of what had happened in West Bengal in the wake of Singur and Nandigram, and there was criticism of the fact that many of the peasants were dispossessed to make way for this car plant in Singur, said, but look, I mean, you know, when London and Manchester were built, you also had similar dispossession of the peasants. Therefore, why get too worried about it? Because in effect what he implied is that we have a historical process where just as those who were dispossessed by the creation or building of London and Manchester were subsequently absorbed and in fact witnessed much higher levels of living. Likewise, even today's dispossessed would subsequently get absorbed and witness an increase in the levels of living. Therefore, there is a view which in fact probably is implicitly believed by even the great economists of our time, that countries like India and China are witnessing a transformation similar to what Polanyi was talking about, similar to the great transformation witnessed in the advanced capitalist countries. Now, basically, the purpose of my lecture is to say that this is not the case. The fact that this is not the case is something which again is pretty obvious. I mean, we see primitive accumulation of capital taking place. We of course see that substantial numbers of peasants are exposed to serious economic distress, which has resulted in a mass suicide of peasants over the last several years. Facts are very well known, I need not go into it. We also find that there is a migration out of rural India in search of employment outside. We find, for instance, from the writings of a number of people that peasants are increasingly finding agriculture to be an unviable activity and are leaving agriculture in quest of employment opportunities outside. So the fact, and we of course know that there is serious dispossession that is taking place of peasants and small producers for the setting up of capitalist units, not only in India, but also in China. As a matter of fact, many of you may have seen in the newspapers that recently in a place called Wuhan in China, there was actual resistance to such a process of dispossession taking place. And likewise, according to statistics, almost 80,000 clashes occur every year in China between the peasantry and the militia because of the fact that there are episodes of dispossession of the peasantry to make room for industrialization, to make room for the setting up of industrial units of various kinds. So the fact that a process of both stock dispossession as well as flow reduction in incomes of the peasantry and petty producers is taking place. In short, the fact that you have a process of primitive accumulation of capital that Marx had talked about taking place in India is not in doubt. What is, however, happening is that those who are victims of this process of primitive accumulation of capital, who are migrating in quest of employment outside, are in fact not getting sufficient employment. That in fact they are swelling the labor reserves rather than getting absorbed into the productive army of labor. They are rather swelling the labor reserves. The swelling of the labor reserves in India is something which manifests itself, among other things, as an increase in informal sector employment. I know Chairman Dr. Unni is in fact an expert on this. I speak with some nervousness on this topic in her presence, but the fact of the matter is that what we call informal sector activity is really a question of the swelling of the labor reserves. The fact that not enough, what the ILO calls decent employment, is available in India is a reflection of the absence of tightness in the labor market of the sort I was talking about in the context of the advanced countries. In the context of the advanced countries, a tightness in the labor market developed, because of which trade unions could bid up wages, and therefore employment became decent employment. As opposed to this, if you do not have tightness in the labor market, then of course those who are looking for work, in fact, join a labor market that is relatively loose. They therefore work under all kinds of conditions which do not amount to decent work, which amount therefore to what we call informal employment, which is not decent work, which is not decent employment, which is in fact at levels of wages way below what organized sector workers have been getting. Now this has a remarkable implication. The implication is that we actually have high rates of growth, but if you have the rates of growth being accompanied by a swelling of the labor reserves, then the swelling of the labor reserves manifests itself in an increase in absolute poverty. Let's see why. Because if you have substantial labor reserves, then even those workers or employees who are unionized would find it very difficult to have increases in their real wage rates. If you have substantial labor reserves, then you find that the organized sector's workers' real wages do not increase, may even be subject to a certain downward drag. Even if it doesn't actually fall, nonetheless there is very little increase in their real wage rate. On the other hand, if you look at the average income of those who constitute the labor reserves, who, if you like, are a part of the informal sector employment that is swelling, then their average income is lower than the average income of the peasants, the small producers, the petty producers, whose disposition has added to labor reserves. So you find a decline in average income. I mean, if you think of the weighted average income of the three categories, one of which is the organized workers, one of which is, let us say, the peasants and agricultural laborers in the countryside, and one of which is the swelling labor reserves, then you find that a change in the proportion between number 2 and number 3, the change in weight between number 2 and number 3, would actually give rise to an overall lowering of the weighted average income, precisely because of the fact that the income of those in the labor reserves would on average be lower than the income of those who are petty producers or their dependents on average. Now this increase in absolute poverty is something for which there is sufficient evidence. One of the remarkable things about India is that notwithstanding very significant increases in our growth rate, which until recently was close to 7 to 8% per annum, certainly in this century, you find notwithstanding very significant increases in our GDP growth rates, the extent of hunger and malnutrition is something which has quite clearly increased. This is something which is clear even if you look at consumption data. For instance, if you compare 2004-05 with 2009-10, which are both years of large sample, national sample surveys, you find that between these two dates, while the proportion of the rural population which enjoyed 2,200 calories or less per person per day has gone up from around 69 to 74%, the proportion of the urban population which enjoyed 2,100 calories per person per day or less has gone up from 64.5 to 68%. So in both cases, there has been an increase, and the calorie norms are the norms that define poverty in India, even according to the estimates of the Planning Commission. So you find that the extent of malnutrition, the extent of hunger, certainly defined in calorie terms, has increased precisely in this period from 2004-05 to 2009-10, when we have generally been talking about high growth rates, because this was a period which just ends around the time that the capitalist crisis in the world begins. The same is easily seen from macro level data. Macro level data show, for instance, that you take British India, that means in quotes British India, the India that constituted the direct colony of the British, then you find that in British India, at the beginning of the 20th century, annual per capita food grain absorption was about 200 kilograms annual. By the time of independence, this had fallen quite dramatically to in fact less than 150 kilograms. Subsequently, there has been and there was an increase with enormous efforts by the Indian state until about the end of the 1980s to approximately 180 kilograms, which of course is less than what it was at the beginning of the century for British India, but nonetheless was higher than what it was at the time of independence. After that, first it plateaued, and now it has come down quite sharply to about 165 kilograms annually. Now clearly, therefore, we find that there is a decline as far as the ability of the people to avoid hunger, the ability of the people to avoid malnutrition, all of which are essential definitions of poverty. There has been a decline in people's ability to avoid the fate of being absolutely poor. In fact, the number of people who can be considered absolutely poor has gone up precisely in a period of high growth rate. The reason for it lies in what I was talking about, namely, we have a situation in which, on the one hand, a process of primitive accumulation of capital, much the way that it had occurred in the advanced capitalist countries, is occurring in our country, as indeed it is occurring in China. But on the other hand, this is not accompanied by anything like a process of absorption of those who are distressed and dispossessed into the capitalist workforce at decent wages. On the other hand, they constitute a swelling labor reserve, and the swelling labor reserve constitutes, as it were, a location of absolute poverty. As a matter of fact, it is not only the swelling labor reserves in towns, but once you find swelling labor reserves in towns, then you find that even in the countryside, those who are distressed linger on as a distressed population at lower and lower levels of subsistence, and therefore they too are ones who are exposed to an increased incidence of absolute poverty. So the fact that growth in our economy is accompanied by an increase in absolute poverty is, to my mind, a reflection of this phenomenon, that while we have a process of primitive accumulation of capital taking place, the absorption of the distressed and dispossessed into the ranks of productive laborers at decent wages is something which is not taking place. That means even though we have high rates of GDP growth, these high rates of GDP growth, as is well known, are not generating a sufficiently high rate of labor absorption. The question which arises is that, is this only a temporary phenomenon? I mean, is this something which is just happening now? After all, everybody knows that even in the advanced countries, things didn't happen immediately. They happened over a long period of time. The process of absorption took a very long period of time. But on the other hand, ultimately, there was this absorption. Or are we actually visualizing an altogether new historical phase where such absorption is no longer on the agenda? I would argue the latter. I believe that the reason why in the advanced countries the distressed and the dispossessed small producers and their dependents managed to get absorbed into capitalist industry and generally into capitalist activities as a productive workforce, there were three basic reasons for this. The first reason has to do with an enormous migration that took place from Europe to all over the world, in particular to the temperate regions of white settlement, which basically include Canada, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and so on. As a matter of fact, in the 19th century, you had two waves of enormous migration that took place all over the world. There was one wave of enormous migration, about 50 million people migrated from Europe to the temperate regions of white settlement. There was a second wave of migration where you had large numbers of people from countries like India and China, the tropical regions of the world. From there, the migration was to the tropical regions of the world. Indians migrated to the West Indies, they migrated to Fiji, they migrated, and likewise the Chinese, to other areas as indentured labor, as coolie labor, and so on. These two waves of migration were kept distinct. The temperate region migration, basically consisting of the white migrants, drove off the local inhabitants from the land in countries like the United States and Australia, Canada, and so on, and occupied that land. As a result, they set themselves up as farmers. The scale of migration was such that if you look at Britain, for instance, between the period 1810 and 1914, the First World War, for almost a century, every year, approximately half the increase in British population was simply migrating outwards. It is this which played a crucial role in developing the tightness in the labor market and in ensuring that the dispossessed really did not become destitute, hanging around in large numbers all over the country, but rather had this safety valve, this option of migrating elsewhere and setting themselves up as farmers. Of course, because they had this option, this meant that even the real wages could not fall too low, because if it is the case that you have a certain reservation price in the form of an income that you can earn by setting yourself as a farmer, by migrating outside, then that reservation price also puts a floor to the real wage that those who stay behind earn, because if the real wage fell below that floor, then they can always migrate outwards. Now, this was a huge wave of migration, and it was a crucial factor in ensuring that the dispossessed and the destitute, the victims of the process of primitive accumulation of capital, did not linger on in absolute poverty, but actually had this option to improve their conditions, and in the process contributed also to an improvement in the condition of the workers who stayed behind in capitalist enterprises in Europe itself, because they could get themselves unionized, there was tightness in the labor market, they could enforce higher real wages. The second way in which capitalism managed to, early capitalism or capitalism in the advanced countries managed to overcome the effects of this dispossession is through the fact that a lot of the dispossession did not even occur domestically. A lot of the dispossession, in fact, occurred in the colonies. We all know this as the so-called deindustrialization process. British textiles, in fact, dispossessed not just British local textile producers who are petty producers, but in a very significant way, textile producers in India and China. Now, to the extent that happened, then the impact of the dispossession was not felt within the homeland itself, but was felt abroad. And to the extent that the counterpart of this dispossession was the development of the British textile industry, to which you could take the locally dispossessed quite easily because they constituted a numerically small proportion. So you found that this contributed greatly to the fact that the local dispossessed, who were a relatively smaller proportion, could be absorbed into capitalist industrial activities. The third factor that played a very important role is that early industrialization, in fact, was highly labor intensive. Even when you had mechanization, much of the machines that were produced were machines that were almost produced by bare hands. As a result, machinery production is something which itself was highly labor intensive.
As a result, even though machinery may displace workers in one particular branch, the production of those machines absorbed large numbers of workers where that was taking place. So for all these reasons, you found that in the initial experience of capitalist development, the process of primitive accumulation of capital did not give rise, except perhaps for a brief transitional period, to an increase in absolute poverty, because there were all these safety valves which were available to it. None of these is replicable today. We don't have any possibilities of migration to the so-called empty spaces of the world, where you can drive out local inhabitants and occupy their land. We do not have the possibility of inflicting deindustrialization on colonies of our own, and this is true of today's third world countries generally, including countries like India and China. And finally, today's capitalist activities are much less labor or employment intensive than the capitalist activities of that particular type. On the contrary, you find very significant increases in labor productivity growth, which basically imply that high rates of GDP growth are accompanied by very low rates of employment growth. I need hardly tell an audience of this kind that the rate of growth of employment in any particular sector or in the economy as a whole is nothing else but the difference between the rate of GDP growth and the rate of growth of labor productivity. You find that with high rates of GDP growth, the rate of growth of labor productivity is also correspondingly high. And what is more, if you look even at a country like China, which has, for instance, very high rates of manufacturing growth, the high rates of manufacturing growth are still accompanied by such high rates of labor productivity growth in manufacturing that Chinese manufacturing hardly absorbs an increasing number of people in employment. That means, if you like, the elasticity of employment with respect to output is something which is not only low, but in fact it is itself a function of the rate of growth of output, where higher the rate of growth of output, lower is the elasticity. So you have a situation where we do not have any of the safety valves which were available to early capitalism or available to classical capitalism as far as absorbing those who are distressed or dispossessed among the petty producers by capitalist development as far as they are concerned. Which is why you have this remarkable situation where very high rates of GDP growth, very high rates of growth of output are nonetheless accompanied by an accentuation of absolute poverty. Now this has a number of very serious implications. It has social implications which I don't want to go into, which I can just very briefly mention, maybe just in passing. That you see what is called modernization. What's called modernity? The development of the individual, the development of the secular individual, the development of the individual as a free agent in some sense, is something which is accompanied by or is predicated upon a breaking up of the old community. You know, the old community, say if you have in our country basically a caste-based rural community, of which things like hap panchayats are in fact the reflections. Breaking the old community is something which constitutes a precondition for the development of the individual, for the development of modernity. Of course, this in turn is something which is accompanied by the formation of newer communities, trade unions, class organizations, struggle of the workers, struggle for freedom, and so on, all of which give rise to a newer community where people come together not because they are born in the same place, not because they are part of a certain caste order, not because of their birth, that is, but out of choice, because of the places in which they work. You have organization of workers, and the organization of workers is something which occurs because all of them happen to work in a particular place, no matter where they come from. So if you like, there's a transition which takes place in which older communities are in fact broken and newer communities are forged, and the newer communities are forged on the basis of individual choice. People come together to struggle in the form of newer communities. Now, if you have a situation where you find that many who, as it were part of the production structure underlying the older community, do not find the possibility of employment outside, they linger on, as I said, as distressed producers, then you find that the older communities continue. And therefore you have the continuation of patriarchy, the continuation of caste, the continuation of khap panchayats, in fact the continuation of the whole big bang lot of the old order. Now this is something which we actually also observe, and is something which is a serious impediment on our march to modernity. But that's not something which I want to discuss in any detail now. The other thing which I think is really quite important, therefore, is that if we are thinking in terms of an improvement in the conditions of living of the ordinary people, which is after all the essence of any development, then that improvement is unlikely to come about by following the route which had been followed by the advanced capitalist countries, or by today's advanced capitalist countries. Because if the historical possibilities open to them are no longer open to us, if it is the case that the fact of the great transformation occurring there was really, if you like, historically fortuitous, because all kinds of possibilities happen to be open to them, possibilities not necessarily very pleasant ones, but nonetheless possibilities that were open to them, driving away the Amerindians from their land, or whatever, inflicting deindustrialization of India and China, are not very pleasant things, but nonetheless there were historic possibilities available to them, which are not available to a corresponding development scenario in countries like India and China. Then it would follow that we have to have a completely different path of development, that we have to really think in terms of an alternative trajectory of development. And this alternative trajectory of development must be one that eschews, that avoids that entire process of destruction of petty producers, that entire process of primitive accumulation of capital, that entire process of inflicting distress upon a whole range of small producers. But on the other hand, it is of course true that productivity, labor productivity, land productivity have got to increase, because that is something which is a facilitating factor in improving the living conditions of the people. So if we are going to have an increase in labor and land productivity without the kind of destruction of petty production that capitalism had inflicted earlier, then we would have to choose an alternative path, and this alternative path can only be one where the scale of production is increased, where technological upgradation takes place, where modern methods of production are introduced, but through a process of coming together of the small producers themselves, not through their dispossession, but through their coming together, which of course I imagine is a kind of philosophy behind this institute itself, namely through a process of cooperativization, through a process of collectivization, through a process of pooling, through a process of grouping of small producers, we actually can have larger and larger units of the kind that capitalism develops, but it develops by actually expropriating the petty producers by displacing them. So instead of displacing petty producers from their means of production, we actually have a pooling of the means of production of the petty producers such that the scale of their production unit increases and of course they become technologically upgraded. Now this is something which would of course require a very different approach to development. It's my view that approaches to development are not just based on what is rational, but approaches to development are determined essentially by very powerful vested interests, very powerful social forces, or very powerful class forces. In particular, the kind of economic strategy that we pursue today, which is a part of our neoliberal economic policy, is dictated essentially by the fact that there is a hegemony of the corporate financial interests in today's capitalist world. This hegemony of the corporate financial interests has one very important implication. And that implication is that they would like the state to defend their interests. Let me just make a slight detour here. You see, for instance, in the 1930s, we had the Great Depression. The Great Depression brought acute misery as far as the peasants are concerned. Many of them got indebted and so on. As a result, many of them joined in large numbers the anti-colonial struggle. In the 1930s, there was a mass upsurge which buttressed the anti-colonial struggle in rural India. A condition for drawing the dispossessed peasantry to the anti-colonial, or the distressed peasantry to the anti-colonial struggle, was a promise that free India would give them a better deal. As a matter of fact, after independence, you actually had a situation where the peasantry was offered a better deal. I'm not saying all sections of the peasantry benefited. I'm not saying that agricultural laborers benefited as much as the peasants did, but nonetheless, when you look at the peasantry, there was an attempt at offering them a better deal, which consisted of the following. They were protected from the vicissitudes of world market price fluctuations. They were given subsidized credit through bank nationalization. They were given subsidized inputs. They were given assured remunerative prices for a number of crops. They were given, there was actually procurement by government agencies at these assured prices for a number of crops. They were given, cheap electricity, fertilizers, and so on. And of course, the government undertook substantial research in order to come up with new methods of production, and these were disseminated through a massive extension service which the government itself set up. Therefore, you had a situation where the state was acting in a way where it even reached certain benefits to the peasantry. It protected, promoted, nurtured the petty producers and the peasants in general. Today what you have is in fact a reversal of that. You have a situation where extension services are virtually over. You have a situation where the subsidies which used to be given through a number of inputs have been whittled down greatly. You have a situation where even though we still have nationalized banks, subsidized low-cost credit to the peasantry has been reduced greatly, where most of them are now driven to the arms of moneylenders. You have a situation where even though you have procurement prices which are supposed to be remunerative, for a very long time they were actually kept low, and the government was even beginning to withdraw increasingly from procurement operations. After the 2008 price rise, there has been some rethink on this, but fundamentally the kind of support which was being enjoyed by the peasantry and by small producers earlier is something which is no longer being enjoyed. I mean, in fact, a classic example of this is this whole argument for introducing FDI in retail. If you have FDI in multi-brand retail, then that is certainly going to expose large numbers of petty traders to distress and destitution. So you have increasingly a situation where the state no longer protects the small producers, the petty traders, the way it used to do, but rather is withdrawing from that role. Instead, it is concentrating on a role where you, of course, have the state substantially backing the corporate financial interests. I think this is the real change that has taken place, not only in India, in large parts of the world, in the state's position in the era of neoliberalism. Think of the United States. There is, if President Obama tries to introduce healthcare reforms where some more healthcare is going to be provided to the ordinary people, there is massive opposition. But on the other hand, likewise, if he wants to increase government spending in order to reduce employment, there is massive opposition. But $13 trillion have been made available from federal funds for sustaining the financial system, no opposition. On the contrary, that's welcome. So you increasingly have a situation where the state acts to the tune of the corporate financial interest. Now, if that is the case, then the kind of alternative trajectory that I'm talking about is an alternative trajectory that becomes increasingly difficult to enforce within the overall confines of the kind of social system that we have. To my mind, this constitutes, of course, the case